Well, Sibelius became a very important composer, both as a Finnish composer to the Finns, and after the beginning of the 20th century, a very important composer in the evolution of 20th century music. He rescued the symphonic form from the expansionist, late Romantic Austro-German tradition that culminated in the works by Mahler and Mahler's contemporaries, which were very large structures, very large works in duration and ambition. Sibelius is important now for having written 7 abstract symphonies, which increasingly developed a desire for compression, concision, and clarity. And these are all qualities that both his contemporary composers and today's generation, many of today's generation, value. This is not a competition between Mahler and Sibelius. They're both wonderful symphonists, but they both developed in different ways from different sources. Mahler came from the tradition of German Romanticism, and Sibelius really evolved through, first of all, an admiration for Wagner, and then the Russian school, particularly Tchaikovsky. But he cast them aside, and by the time he wrote the Third Symphony, he had left behind this sort of national romanticism and embarked on a quest for a sort of classicism. And that led him to explore the last 4 symphonies, 4, 5, 6, and 7, as almost unique statements of symphonic thought, which survive today. The symphonic form was getting out of hand, in a nutshell. So we have the examples of Strauss, Richard Strauss, Gustav Mahler, early Schoenberg, writing very large-scale works, which they thought was appropriate, and they thought it was a natural development of the tradition that they inherited as young composers. And I think Sibelius does offer an alternative route, a reaction against that, because the large-scale forms that these German, Austrian composers wrote really did go out of fashion. Well, Sibelius was born into a Swedish-speaking family. His father died when Sibelius was 2, leaving huge debts for his widow and the 2 children. She was pregnant with her 3rd child when her husband died. But Sibelius, therefore, was a Swedish-speaking Finn. He didn't learn Finnish until he was sent to a Finnish-speaking academy school at the age of 6 or 7, and he retained his affection and love of the Swedish language throughout his life. In the 1920s onwards, if he got excited talking to his wife, Aino, he would lapse into Swedish, because that was his habit, and he found a natural expression. His songs, of which there are over 100, almost all of them set to Swedish texts, because as a child, as a young man, he developed a very great fondness for Swedish poetry. Sibelius grew up in a middle-class family where music was reasonably important. There was a piano in the house, so he could become familiar with a piano and started playing the piano before he started playing the violin. He didn't particularly take to the piano. He didn't find it a very sympathetic instrument. And when his Uncle Per presented him with the first of 2 violins that Uncle Per gave him, Sibelius just fell in love with the violin. I mean, he really didn't do formal violin lessons until he was 14, but he made rapid progress to the point when he went away to Music Academy in Helsinki, he was capable of playing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, which is no mean feat. In between, he had developed two things: a love of learning and playing the violin, but also a knack for writing music. And as there were three siblings, there was himself, his brother Christian, and his younger sister Linda, all playing different instruments, they formed a piano trio. So by the time Sibelius was 15, 16, he was writing music for the immediate members of his family. And some of this music survives. Before he went to Helsinki, he really hadn't experienced orchestral music. He didn't therefore write for it. He didn't write for orchestra. And this takes us up to his 3 years under Martin Vegelius, the institute director. Martin Vegelius was a Wagnerian, and Vegelius was very keen for him to study abroad. And it would have been natural for Sibelius to have gone to St. Petersburg, because after all, St. Petersburg was very close. There was a regular railway service between Helsinki and St. Petersburg. Finland was part of the Russian Empire, and St. Petersburg was a very important musical center. And so it would have been natural for Sibelius to have gone there. But Vegelius influenced him and said, no, you should go to Berlin. And he did go to Berlin. And it was in Berlin that he first heard two things: contemporary music and the most wonderful playing by orchestras. And this was a sea change in his attitude to the power of music. When he came back from Berlin, became aware of Eino Jannefelt, who became his wife. But then he went off to Vienna. This was a second year of hard work, studying under strict teachers. And it did Sibelius a lot of good. It developed his orchestral an awareness of writing for orchestra. And the upshot of this, of course, from Vienna was a discovery really of the Kalevala, and which also led to the ability to express music in the Finnish language, because the Kalevala was written in Finnish, and the composition of his first great work for orchestra, Kullervo, known as a symphonic poem, but could also be regarded as a symphony, or indeed as a cantata symphony, as the early choral works by Mahler, Das klagende Lied and such like, are very similar sort of outline, similar ambition. Well, Sibelius adored the violin, but he never became a true virtuoso. We have to understand that. He started too late. Sibelius really began lessons at 14. Sibelius had terrible stage nerves, and this, of course, is fatal if you're a violinist, a soloist. He came to realize that his métier was not going to be as a violin virtuoso. His métier was as a composer of increasing genius, and you've only got to hear these early orchestral pieces to understand the astonishing individuality of the sound of the music. He was friendly with a very good violinist, Willy Burmester, who he would have met in Vienna in the 1890s. Willy Burmester was a virtuoso. He was also the leader of the Robert Kajanis Orchestra in Helsinki up until about 1895. So Sibelius knew Burmester very well and was an admirer of his playing. He did announce the dedication of his new violin concerto to Burmester, and Burmester was obviously delighted and was looking forward to performing it. And Sibelius was busy writing this concerto, causing him no end of trauma, staying up at night, composing at night, which he did at various stressful times of his life, right through to the Seventh Symphony. He was under severe financial pressure. He was approaching the need to pay bills to move to Ainola. He was never a good person with money. He was always in debt. Burmester was a busy man and said he could play it in March, I think in March, in Helsinki. This was not soon enough for Sibelius. Sibelius needed a concert with a big premiere earlier than that to revive his financial fortunes. So he entrusted it to a second-rate violinist, a professor at the academy, the institute in Helsinki, a man called Novacek. And this was a terrible mistake because the premiere took place in early that year, 1904. And Novacek was not up to this virtuoso material at all. He kept saying to Burmester in writing, "Don't worry, Herr Burmester, this is your work. You will give the premiere in Central Europe, in Berlin, where it deserves to be heard." Then withdrew it. Burmester saw the score. Sibelius had to write to him, say, "May I have my score back, please?" Because Sibelius decided that it wasn't adequate. He withdrew it, and Burmester was suddenly left without a premiere. And he announced in correspondence that he was going to wait at least a couple of years before he revisited and reworked the concerto. It was a little bit within that period that he did, because there was the possibility through his publisher, Robert Lienau, in Berlin, that they were pressing him for big orchestral music, and they were aware that there was a violin concerto, and they were suggesting very strongly that Sibelius gave the German premiere in 1905, and Sibelius set immediately to revising it. He did it in 6 weeks, which anybody familiar with the first and the final versions is an astonishing short period of reworking from the first version to the final version. Burmester was wanting to obviously perform it in Berlin, but his publisher had other ideas. They'd got Richard Strauss lined up to conduct it. Wow, that's quite a story. That's quite something for the emerging talent of the Finnish composer into the European mainstream. And it didn't allow Burmester to take part. Also, Burmester wasn't available on the date. So that was entrusted to Karl Haller, who was the leader of the Berlin orchestra that Strauss was the conductor of, presumably the Berlin Philharmonic. And this was the final straw for poor Burmester. He had had the promise of a dedication. He had been promised a premiere on each occasion, and he got none of that. And he was very upset, and he said, "I will never play this concerto," and he never did. Lots of people are very happy to connect Sibelius with descriptions of nature and so on. I don't do that. I see Sibelius largely as an abstract composer, but I absolutely understand why some people do. I suppose if you listen carefully to the concerto, you will find examples of all those descriptive elements. And that again probably accounts for his popularity from the wonderful opening. Probably the finest opening of any violin concerto, the most poetic, to the extreme virtuosity that we hear the soloist play in the cadenza, which is just astonishing. Through to elements throughout the concerto, the warmly romantic sound of the opening of the slow movement. the entrance of the solo violins, singing a long song. Long cantilena, which is immediately memorable, with a sort of impassioned middle. And then we come to the finale. Well, the Polonaise for Polar Bears, but it's also a danse macabre, and it never relents. It's an astonishingly difficult work for the soloist. Typical Sibelius trait is opening a bar off the beat. It takes getting used to, both for the players in the orchestra and for the conductor. It shouldn't sound difficult. It should sound effortless, but you should be aware that it's not easy. In other words, the virtuosity should overcome the difficulty for the listener to just sit back and enjoy it. But easier said than done if you're the soloist.